So thank you for the warm introduction. I was told long ago that if you bring food and you're not a very good speaker, everyone will forgive you. So I did bring some donuts today. So, if the talk's not very good, I apologize, but at least the food will be good afterward. Well, I was asked to speak today about bouncing back after hardships. And I suspect there are many people here that have had some real hardships in their lives. And as I was preparing this and thinking about it, I was thinking about some of the hardships that I have been through in my life, but also some of the great accomplishments that I've been able to perform and to be proud of as well, because I don't believe that anything that is worth achieving is done easily. Things that are of much importance, things that are difficult to do, oftentimes are the things that bring us the most satisfaction and joy. So our main point, they say as a speaker not to give away your main point too early, but I'm going to do just that. My main point is this: when life gives you trials, seek the Lord and choose to smile. And it has to be true because it rhymes. Everything that rhymes just happens to be true. So when you came in, hopefully you got a piece of paper and a pen. If not, raise your hand and we'll come around and we'll make sure that we get you one so you have my outline. When life gives you trials, seek the Lord and choose to smile. So none of us can choose our trials. The trials that we have in life, the things that happen to us, we don't get to pick. That when life comes our way, it just comes at us fast. But what we can choose is our attitude. And we can choose the reason why we have the attitude that we do. In James chapter 1, verse 2, perhaps the most frustrating verse in the entire Bible, I'll read it to you. It says, "Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy." I have read this verse at times kicking and screaming. Because when trials come our way, when hardships, when sufferings comes, we don't want to see that as an opportunity for joy. I don't know if you're like me, but I want to see a trial as an opportunity to throw a little pity party for myself. To feel bad for a little while, maybe to be angry, tell somebody off, cut somebody off in traffic. When trials come our way, we don't want it to be an opportunity for joy. We just want to, self-medicate with some destructive behavior. Our question for discussion, and here's what I want to do to kick things off, is I want you to just kind of pair up with the people around you. Try to find somebody that is sitting close by you right now, and just take about 45 seconds and talk about this. Name an accomplishment that you are proud of. So this should be something that was difficult to achieve. And what did this achievement cost you? Okay? So think about something that you have achieved in your life that was difficult, and what did that achievement cost you? Pair up with the people around you. You've got 45 seconds. Go. We're going to bring it back in. So I was kind of wandering around listening. I heard some great answers. So we were talking about accomplishments. What kind of things did you guys come up with? What did it cost you to achieve these accomplishments? You can just shout them out. Friends, yes. Lots of time. Blood, sweat, and tears. Yep. Energy.
No matter what anybody else says, you trust Lord, because you know you got your back, and it doesn't matter what anyone else says.
Right on. So when I was in high school, I decided I wanted to try out for the hockey team. And the only problem was I had never touched a puck on the ice. Ice hockey, this is. So I had done a little bit of ice skating. My best friend Brent Proley and I decided we were going to try to make the team. We were 15 years old, and we went to the skating rink a couple times, practice. He was going to try out to be the goalie. I was going to try out to be an offenseman. And we practiced as best we could, but we didn't have any opportunity to actually touch a puck on the ice until tryouts. So tryouts come, so we go, we get dressed in the locker room. We go out there, the coach takes this big bucket of pucks and he dumps it on the ice. So I'm skating up to it and I start sticking on a little bit. I'm trying my best. Well, my best friend Brent, he comes over to me and says, "Hey, I got a problem." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "I forgot my cup." Wasn't talking about drinking cup. He was talking about a very important piece of equipment for a goalie. And I said, "What are you going to do?" And he said, "Well, I'm not going to tell the coach, because if I tell the coach, they'll make me go off the ice." He said, I don't have it. So he decided to try out for the hockey team without that very important piece of equipment. And I watched him get hit a few times. And he just took it, and he grinned and got through it as best he could. I could tell he was in so much pain. I could see tears coming down his face. But he just kept plowing ahead. And guess what? I made the team, and he made the team. And I was very, very proud of that, because it took a little courage. It took boldness. It took for him an incredible amount of courage to make the team. And I was Brent's best man at his wedding, and I told this story in front of all of his friends, his family, his new wife's family. I told it in front of all of them. He was so embarrassed. So I got married a year later, and it was his turn to kind of give the speech. And he said, Luke told a very embarrassing story about me a year ago that had to do with hockey. And he said, now I'm going to tell you a story about him that has to do with hockey. So, and this was a true story. This happened as well. He said, I was sitting down to dinner. We had Luke over for dinner, and his mom was there, and his sisters were there. And it was time for Brent and I to go to get our hockey equipment and to load it up into the car. So I went out, I got my bag from his living room, and I set it down for a second in the kitchen. And when I did, my cup fell out of the bag onto the ground. And his sister saw it. And she said, Luke, why is your cup so much smaller than Brent's is? He told that in front of my wife. Couldn't believe it. So I'm still looking for ways to get him back. If you got any suggestions for me, let me know. All right, so we talked about accomplishments, but I want to go to the other end of the spectrum. And I want to talk about some of the trials, the hardships. Like when your best friend tells a really embarrassing story about you at your wedding reception. Maybe that's not it. But here's what I want you to do. I want you to pair up again and talk this time about the last great hardship that you experienced. What was the last great trial that you went through? And then talk about how did God reveal himself to you during that difficulty? The last great hardship that you had, how did God reveal himself to you through that difficulty? Go ahead, pair up, talk about it. All right. Well, thank you for sharing, everyone. Sometimes life comes at you pretty fast, and sometimes we don't stop and look back at some of the hardships that we've experienced and just thinking about the question, why? Thinking about that question, why? So as I was introduced earlier, I am a pastor at Cedar Creek Church. I've worked at Cedar Creek Church since 2001. I am married. I am married to a wonderful woman named Sarah, and we were blessed in 2008 with our first child. We had a son named Jackson, and Jackson was born perfectly healthy, beautiful baby, and doing awesome. Everything is great. And one day, I got a call. I was at work, and my wife said, hey, I think something is a little bit wrong with Jackson. She said, he's just fussy, he's not himself. And I said, well, you probably should take him to the doctor and just get him checked out. I'm sure he'll be okay. So she takes him to the doctor. They look him over, and they said, oh, it's just colic. It's, normal baby type stuff. And they sent her home. So a few hours later, she calls me and she says, I still think something's wrong. And I don't know why, but it seems like moms always know when something's off with their kids. And I said, well, honey, take him back. So she took him back to the doctor a second time in the same day. Checked him out, looked at it. Nope, he's fine. Well, the next morning, he was not himself at all. He was very sick, very upset. So we took him back to the pediatrician a third time in a 24-hour span. And this time they said, yeah, I think something might be off. They said, let's take him to the hospital and let's do a bigger exam. So take him to the hospital exam, and they found a hernia, which they said, you know what, this happens with babies sometimes. We'll go ahead and we'll do a quick surgery. We'll fix it. So we got that scheduled for the next day. Went in, did the surgery, and then he was in recovery. So we said, okay, great, no problem. Well, a day later, he's still not better. So we take him back to the pediatrician. At this point, they probably think we're crazy or something, we're taking him to the doctor so much. And they went and they looked and checked him out, and they said, well, we found another hernia. So we said, we need to do another surgery. They said, no big deal, it'll just be quick. So we set it up, we go in, we have another surgery, and when the surgeon came back out, she came to us and said, when we were in there and we were looking, said things just didn't seem right. And that's something you never want to hear a surgeon say. She said, we removed some fluid from inside his belly, And she said it was kind of straw-colored, kind of murky. She said it was fluid that should not be in there. And she said, we want to take him overnight. We want to continue to do some tests. So we're kind of scared. We're young parents. And we took him in. They did some more tests. Couldn't find out what was wrong. Day goes by. They're doing tests. Can't find out what's wrong. 3 days go by. They're doing all sorts of tests. They still cannot find out what's wrong with our child. He's very sick. He's throwing up. He's vomiting. He's running a fever. Can't figure it out. They did a test where they said, we figured out that the fluid that was in his abdominal cavity was actually protein and bits and pieces of his small intestine, that his intestines were being digested within himself, and his organs were very inflamed and sick. He's a very sick little boy. So we still really didn't know what it was. They had a couple of theories, but they just weren't sure at all. So they continued to run tests, did another surgery to drain some of the fluid, and this time there was a ton of fluid, more than a can of pop of fluid, more than 12 ounces they took out. He's 9 months old, a very young baby. Still had no idea what it was. Well, they continued to do scans, and they found out that the source of Jackson's problems was his pancreas. And we didn't even think about a pancreas before this. It's a very small organ. It's tucked in the back of your body, and it's very well insulated, protected. And they said, we think that his pancreas is actually broken. They said it's transected. They said the only way that that happens in young babies is either a car accident, which he wasn't in a car accident. They said maybe if a baby had fallen off of a bike, so if you had a baby on the back of the bike and fell just right, that would potentially be it. It wasn't on a bike. They said, or perhaps it's child abuse. And they said, we believe that this child was abused. And at that point, my wife and I, as young parents, I'm a pastor at our church, we were investigated for child abuse. And at that point, they ordered a bunch of new tests that we had no say in, we could not give consent for, tests that were really out of our control. They did an x-ray of every bone of his body. They did eye tests to see if he had been shaken. They did all sorts of tests to find out if he had been abused. And my wife and I, through the very difficult time, we found ourselves in a place where we were very frustrated and angry because we wanted our son to get better. And we knew that we hadn't abused him, and Jackson had not been in the care of anybody that we didn't trust. So we sought after God. And a million times I asked the question, God, why? Why would you let us go through this? Why would you let my son, who I love so much and I know you love, why would you let him go through this to be so sick? And I prayed for a miracle. I prayed that God would instantly heal him, that a scan would come back and show that his pancreas was fixed and he was okay. And God never answered that prayer, as I hoped that he would. And I sat there, and I sat in a hospital room, and I looked up and I said, God, why? Why would you do this to my son that I love so much? So friends, that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about the why. Why does God give us trials? Why does God give us pain? Why does he give us hardship? Sometimes where it feels too much even to bear for ourselves. And I want to look today at a young man in the Bible whose name is Joseph. We're going to be hanging out in the book of Genesis. We've got a lot to get through. I will say, though, that trials with a purpose make us tired. And that's in your notes. You can write that down. Trials with a purpose, they make one tired. They make us tired. Trials without purpose make us weary. And those are not the same things. See, a trial with purpose can make us tired. If you study the life of Jesus at all, we find out that Jesus himself, he got tired. Jesus would take time away to pray, to rest, because he was tired at times. But Jesus never got weary. It never got to the point where he was ready to give up on his mission, because he knew that the suffering and the hardships that he experienced were for a purpose. They were for a reason. That is the difference. Friends, we said earlier, you can't control the trials that come at you, but you can control how you respond to those trials, what your attitude is. So Joseph is known as the dreamer. If you've studied Joseph at all, and you're probably familiar with this story, if so, I hope maybe you can see it with fresh eyes today as we look at it. Joseph was a young man who suffered quite a bit, and we're going to look at 3 different trials that Joseph had, different trials for different reasons. The first trial we're going to look at is that Joseph suffered because of the evil of others. Joseph suffered because of the evil of others in his life. So as I said, we got a lot to get through, so I'm going to just kind of dive in. All the verses here, you can go back through and read yourself if you want to go deeper into it. We're going to be flying a little bit, but that's what we got to do to get through all material. So here we go. Genesis 37. So Jacob, that's Joseph's father, settled again in the land of Canaan, where his father lived as a foreigner. This is the account of Jacob and his family. When Joseph was 17 years old, a very young man, he often tended his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers, the son of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. But Joseph reported to his father some of the bad things his brothers were doing. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They could not say a kind word to him. One night Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers about it, they hated him more than ever. Have you ever had anybody hate you just because you're doing well in life? Sure you have. Sure you have. Listen to this dream, Joseph said. We were out in the field, tying up bundles of grain. Suddenly my bundle stood up, and your bundles all gathered around mine and bowed low before mine. His brothers responded, So you think you will be our king, do you? Do you actually think you will reign over us? And they hated him, all the more because of the dreams and the way that he talked about them. Soon Joseph had another dream, and again he told his brothers about it. Listen, I've had another dream, he said. The sun, the moon, the 11 stars, they bowed before me. This time he told the dream to his father as well as to his brothers, but his father scolded him. What kind of dream is that, he said. Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? But while his brothers were jealous of Joseph, his father wondered what the dreams meant. So at this point I'm going to stop for a second and say that nothing that's happened so far is Joseph's fault, right? So the fact that his father loved him more than his brothers, it was nothing that he did. There was no decision he made in that. He has these dreams that I believe came from God. He didn't choose to have these dreams. The only choice that he makes here is to be honest. He tells his brothers about the dream, and he tells his father about the dreams, and because of that, they hate him even more. And his father scolds him. His father's wondering, what could these dreams mean? But all Joseph is doing is just being honest to what's happening to him. We'll pick up in verse 18. When Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him at a distance. As they approached, they made their plans to kill him. Here comes the dreamer, they said. Come on, let's kill him. Let's throw him into one of these cisterns where we can tell our father a wild animal has eaten him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. But when Reuben was the oldest brother, there were 12 brothers in all. When Reuben heard of this scheme, he came to Joseph's rescue. Let's not kill him, he said. Why should we shed any blood? Let's just throw him into this empty cistern here in the wilderness. Then he'll die without us laying a hand on him. So at this point, Reuben has this great idea. Let's not kill him. We'll just throw him in this well and leave him. And if he happens to die, he dies, right? But Reuben had a secret plan going on. He secretly planned to rescue Joseph and return him to his father. So when Joseph arrived, his brothers ripped off the beautiful robe that he was wearing. They grabbed him, they threw him into a cistern. And now the cistern was empty. There was no water in it. Then, just as they were sitting down to eat, they looked up and they saw a caravan of camels in the distance coming toward them. It was a group of Ishmaelite traders taking a load of gum, balm, and aromatic resin from Gilead down to Egypt. Judah, one of the brothers, says to his brothers, What will we gain by killing our brother? We'd have to cover up the crime. Instead of hurting him, let's sell him to those Ishmaelite traders. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. And the brothers agreed. So at this point, Judah has the great idea, you know what, let's not kill him. Instead, let's just sell him and make some money. That's even better. Then we don't have his death on our conscience, and we got a few bucks in our pocket. So when the Ishmaelites, who were Midianite traders, came by, Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the cistern and sold him for 20 pieces of silver. And then the traders took him to Egypt. So everything that's happened here so far, again, is still not Joseph's fault. Joseph's brothers, they take the robe that Joseph had been wearing, they take animal blood and they put it on it, and they give the robe to their father. And they say, isn't this the robe of your son? They can't even bring themselves to say our brother here. They say, isn't this the robe of your son? And when Jacob sees the robe, he begins weeping and crying. And he says, yes, this is my son Joseph's robe. This is the beautiful robe that I gave him. And he's inconsolable. He is completely crestfallen. He is so sad because the son that he loved has been killed. At least that's what he believes. Joseph suffered because of jealousy of the people around him. It was nothing wrong that he did. It was just that the people around him, they were jealous. Growing up, I had a best friend in kindergarten named Lenny. And Lenny lived down the street from me. He was a really cool kid. And when I was little, I had a bike that was black. It was 1 speed, and it did okay. You know, I got around on it. But my friend Lenny, he had this red, Huffy 5-speed bike. And this thing was really cool. It had big rim tires. And I would just see him cruising around, and I'd think, if I only had a bike like Lenny's, that would be awesome. So I invited Lenny to come over and play the one day, and he's over, and we were playing video games. And I said, I'll be right back. So I went outside, and I could see Lenny's red bike there, and I went and I took it, and I hid it in my backyard between some bushes. So then I came back in, and we were playing video games, and it got time for him to go. And Lenny comes out, and he said, "Where's my bike? My bike's not here. I left it right here." And I said, "I don't know. Somebody must have stole it. I don't know why you parked it out in the front. You know, there's bad people around here." So Lenny was upset, and he walked home. And I took his bike. I had the best evening. I rode this bike up and down the street, not so far as to get in front of Lenny's house, but just kind of over on my side. And I went up and down hills, and I felt I'm changing speeds, I'm waving at people. But then at nighttime, I started to feel a little guilty. And I realized that my parents are going to ask, where did this red bike come from that obviously I didn't buy? I'm 6 years old at the time. So I'm thinking about it, and now I got a problem because I got to get rid of this bike, and I'm going to get in trouble with this thing. So I had the great idea. I took his bike, and I drove toward his house, and I'm looking all over. I feel so guilty. And I took it, and I jumped off of it, and I watched this bike roll, and it crashed right in front of his door, and I took off and ran all the way home. And I never told him that I did it. So the next day he said, "You won't believe it. My bike was back." And I said, "That's amazing, Lenny. That is I can't believe it. We must have the most honest thieves around here in the entire world. What an incredible thing. Your bike is back." You know, I'm 34 years old. I still feel bad about that. That happened almost 30 years ago. I was a terrible friend. If any of you know Lenny today, don't tell him it was me. I'm still working up the courage. All right. So sometimes we suffer. Sometimes we suffer because of the evil of others. Sometimes it's because others are jealous of us. And it's not our fault. It was not Joseph's fault. It was not Lenny's fault. It was the evil of others. Sometimes it causes us to suffer. But there's another different type of suffering that happens. Joseph suffered also for doing the right thing. Sometimes you suffer just for doing the right thing. So we're going to pick our story back up here in Genesis 39. When Joseph was taken to Egypt by the Ishmaelite traders, he was purchased by Potiphar, who was an Egyptian officer. Potiphar was the captain of the guard for Pharaoh and the king of Egypt. So Pharaoh, he's the top guy. Potiphar, he is the head of the palace guard, which was a very important job. Because in these days, kings and pharaohs, their lives were constantly under duress. That if you wanted to take over power, you had to kill the king. So there was always a threat on the pharaoh's life. And Potiphar is a very important man. He is the head of the palace guard. He is the one that ends up buying Joseph. Verse 2, "The Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything that he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master." You see, even though Joseph was suffering, he did not curse God. He still trusted. We're going to see this over and over. Verse 3, "Potiphar noticed this, and he realized that the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything that he did. This pleased Potiphar, so he made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of the entire household and everything that he owned. From the day Joseph was put in charge of his master's household and property, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. All the household affairs ran smoothly, and his crops and his livestock flourished. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything that he's owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing, except what kind of food to eat. Joseph was very handsome and a well-built young man. And Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. 'Come and sleep with me,' she demanded. But Joseph refused her. "Look," he told her, "my master trusts me with everything in the entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except you because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God." She kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day, but he refused to sleep with her, and he kept out of the way of her as much as possible. One day, however, no one else was around when he went to do his work. She came and grabbed him by the cloak, demanding, "Come, sleep with me." Joseph tore himself away, but he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house. So we'll stop here just for a second. So Joseph knows that it would be a great sin to do what she wants to do. He knows that it's wrong in his heart. It'd be a great sin against his family, his upbringing. It'd be a great sin against Potiphar, his master, who's been very good to him. And he knew that it'd be a great sin against God. So when temptation comes his way, instead of kind of flirting with temptation, like, what's going on? No, I'm not going to sin, but, we can talk, we can flirt, we can be cool. Instead of doing that, Joseph turned and he runs the other way. And he does so much, and this is kind of crazy. I don't know how this happened, but Potiphar's wife grabs onto his cloak and he runs away from her naked, which is a bad place to be in. So he's a slave, he runs away, he has no cloak right now, and he runs in the other direction. In that moment, that was the best decision he could have made because he was fleeing from sin. He turned around and he went in the opposite direction. He didn't even let his mind go there. He ran away as fast as he could. So what happens as a result of Joseph's great decision to follow God? Well, we'll find out. When she saw that she was holding onto his cloak and he had fled, she called out to her servants. Soon all the men came running. "Look," she said, "my husband has brought this Hebrew slave here to make fools of us. He came into my room to rape me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream, he ran outside and he got away, but he left his cloak behind with me." She kept the cloak with her until her husband came home. Then she told him the story. "That Hebrew slave you brought into your house tried to come in and fool around with me," she said. "But when I screamed, he ran outside, leaving his cloak behind." Potiphar was furious when he heard of his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. So he took Joseph and he threw him into prison, where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison, and he showed him his faithful love. So God has still not abandoned him. God is still with him. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners, over everything that had happened in prison. The warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him and caused him to succeed. So if you're charting it out right now, we see that Joseph's life, it's like a roller coaster. It goes up, he's his father's favorite, and then all of a sudden, it crashes down. His brothers throw him into a well. And then all of a sudden, he gets sold to a very important man, and he's doing great, and his life is on the top. But then Potiphar's wife does this evil thing, and his life crashes down. But no matter if his life was at a high or a low, there's one constant. I don't know if you caught it. I don't know if you picked up on it. The Lord is with Joseph in everything. No matter if he's on top of the world or if he's in the lowest low, God is with him in the moment each and every time. I hope you don't miss that. Joseph follows God. He does the right thing. He chooses not to sin. He walks the holy path. And as a result, he suffers. His reward for doing good is trials and hardship. He suffers because he decided to follow the Lord. You see, friends, when we follow God in all things, there's no guarantee that God is going to spare us from suffering and hardships. Amen. It's to be expected. In John chapter 9, there's this interesting interaction that happens between Jesus and his disciples. They're walking along and they see a man who is born blind. And the disciples, the first question that they ask Jesus is they say, "Teacher, was this man born blind because of his sin or because of his parents' sin?" You see, in this culture, there was this belief that if you suffered, if you had a hardship in your life, if there was either something physical that was wrong with you, or maybe your business decisions didn't go well, they assumed that there was sin. Either you sinned or maybe your parents sinned, and because of that, God was punishing you. So Jesus' response to his disciples is he says, no. Not this man sinned, nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the glory of God could be shown. You see, friends, God is at work in our lives, and we can't always see it. When we are in the middle of hardships and suffering, we have a tendency to cry out, "Why? Why, God? Why would you let me go through this?" it's not always because of our sin. It's not always because of the sin of somebody else. In fact, sometimes you could suffer just because you've done the right thing. But God is there with you in those moments, and He allows us to go through that suffering so that the glory of God could be revealed. And that's what happens with Joseph. So I was kind of thinking about, as I was putting this together, maybe you're familiar with this, maybe not, but there's been a recent story in the news about Colin Kaepernick. If you don't know him, he's a quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers. He's been a very good quarterback over his career, but he decided before this last game that he was going to sit during the national anthem. And the reason why is it was a protest because he believes that not everyone in this country is treated fairly and justly. Specifically, he believes that the African American community is being unfairly treated by the police in this country. So I'm not here to tell you if I think that Colin Kaepernick is a hero or maybe if he's not so much of a hero and done the wrong thing. What I think is interesting is you have a young man who's standing up for his beliefs by sitting down. He's taking a stand, which he is going to suffer for. He is staying true to his beliefs. He is going to suffer for that decision because people are already upset with him. I was listening on the radio yesterday. I heard a Marine veteran call in, and it was this gruff, grizzled voice. You could tell it's just somebody that he was definitely a Marine, and he's been through some tough times in his life. And he said, I hope that nobody speaks poorly about Colin Kaepernick. He said, I went to war and I fought for this country so that he could protest. He said, in other countries, you can't protest. If you do something against the government, against the police force or the military, you'll be hunted down and taken. That's what makes this country great, is that you can stand up for your convictions. Joseph stood up for his convictions. Joseph did what was not popular in that household, but he did what he knew what was right. He stuck to his convictions, and because of that, he suffered for it. If you're serious about following God, you should expect suffering. It should never surprise you. Following God means that suffering is going to happen in your life. Jesus himself said, friends, in this world you will have trials and hardships of many kinds, but take heart because I have overcome the world. The key here is that Jesus never leaves us. Amen. That if we suffer for him, he suffers right there with us. Amen. He does not leave us to suffer on our own, but he stands right next to us, and he stood right next to Joseph. So the third kind of suffering then that we see with Joseph is completely different than the first two kinds. We see that Joseph suffered because of his own bitterness and mistrust. Joseph suffered as well because of his own bitterness and mistrust. I was kind of looking up the difference between the word mistrust and distrust, because I kind of thought, are they the same one? What's the difference? So distrust is often about a situation that we're kind of like, I don't know about that. I don't know if this situation is so good for me. But mistrust is about people. Mistrust specifically is about keeping somebody at arm's length because you're not sure about them. Well, Joseph suffered because of his own bitterness and mistrust. So a lot happens here in the scripture that we don't really have time to go through each and every verse. If you have time on your own to go through and read it, I suggest you do. But I'm going to summarize what happens here at this part of the story. Joseph is in prison. He's in prison for years because of a crime that he didn't commit. Two men get sent to prison with him. One was a cupbearer. He was somebody that would take Pharaoh's cup, so it would be his cup of wine probably, the chalice, and he would drink it before Pharaoh did. And he would drink it. If he didn't die in 30 minutes, then they'd say, okay, now the Pharaoh can drink. What a great job. You are expendable. Another guy was a baker. He was the chief baker for Pharaoh. It was his job to bake food for Pharaoh. Both of these guys, they fall on hard times with Pharaoh. Pharaoh's displeased with them. He sends them to prison. Both of these men have dreams that trouble them, and they don't know what these dreams are all about. And Joseph says, he says, I can't tell you what your dreams mean, but perhaps God through me can, because God was with Joseph, even in prison. So they tell Joseph their dreams, and Joseph interprets it. He tells the cupbearer, you will be restored to your position in 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will forgive you and bring you back. You will get your job back. And he says, please don't forgive me when you are restored. So the baker tells him his dream, and he says, are you sure you want me to tell you what the dream means? And he says, yes. And he says, you will be killed, and you will be impaled on a pole. And sure enough, 3 days later, both of those happened, just as Joseph predicted and has happened in those dreams. But the cupbearer forgets about Joseph. And again, years go by, and Joseph is rotting in prison. Now God is still with him, and the jailer puts Joseph in charge of the other prisoners, and God continues to give him success, even in prison, but he's a prisoner. So Joseph is first sent away from his homeland when he's 17. When he's 30 years old, 30 years, so 13 years has passed of trials and struggles and suffering, Pharaoh has a dream. Pharaoh has a dream that troubles him. He sees 7 cows who are fat and plump. And then he sees 7 cows who are skinny and withered. And the skinny cows eat the plump cows. And Pharaoh doesn't know what this is all about. And who is there in his court but the cupbearer? And the cupbearer says, I remember a young man, Joseph, that I had a dream once I couldn't figure out, and he told me the answer. So Pharaoh says, bring him. So they call for Joseph. They take him, they clean him up, and they bring him to Pharaoh. And Joseph says, tell me your dream. And again he says, I don't know if I can tell you the answer, but God can through me. Pharaoh tells him the dream, and Joseph says, this is what your dreams mean. The 7 fat cows stand for 7 prosperous years. Years that are going to be plentiful, where there will be a bumper crop. After that, though, will follow 7 years of famine. Famine unlike has been seen throughout the world. And he said, what you need to do, Pharaoh, is you need to find somebody who is intelligent, who can take a portion of all of those good crops and store them, so when the 7 tough years come, there's plenty of food for your people. And Pharaoh says, I think I may have just the man. And he takes Joseph, and he elevates him to the number 2 position in all of Egypt, the most powerful, prosperous land in the entire world. So Joseph, again, he's on this roller coaster. He finds himself at the top. He's now the number 2 man in Egypt. And it happens just as Joseph predicted. There's 7 wonderful years. Joseph stores all of the crops. And then in year 2 of the famine has struck all of the known world. And who comes to buy grain in Egypt but Joseph's brothers? The very men that put him in the well and started this journey. So that's where our story picks up. I told you there's a lot. I had to summarize there. So we're at Genesis 41:46. Joseph was 30 years old when he began serving the court of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And when Joseph left Pharaoh's presence, he inspected the entire land of Egypt. So then his brothers come, and although Joseph recognized his brothers, this is 42:8, they did not recognize him. And he remembered the dreams that he'd told them about years before. He said to them, you are spies. You have come to see how vulnerable our land has become. No, my lord, they exclaimed, your servants have simply come to buy food. We are all brothers, members of the same family. We are honest men, sir. We are not spies. Yes, you are, Joseph insisted. You have come to see how vulnerable our land has become. Sir, they said, there are actually 12 of us. We, your servants, are all brothers, sons of a man living in the land of Canaan. Our youngest brother is back there with our father right now, and one of our brothers is no longer with us, which technically wasn't a lie. He wasn't. Although he was standing in front of them, they didn't realize it. Verse 14, Joseph insisted, as I said, you are spies. This is how I will test your story. I swear by the life of Pharaoh that you will never leave Egypt unless your youngest brother comes here. One of you must go and get your brother. I'll keep the rest of you here in prison, and then we'll find out whether or not your story is true. By the life of Pharaoh, if it turns out that you don't have a younger brother, then I will know that you are spies. So right here, here's what's going on. Joseph is testing his brothers. Imagine if you had been wronged like Joseph was, and for years you're thinking about this wrongdoing. It was nothing that Joseph did. It wasn't his fault. But for year after year after year, 13 years, he's thinking about the evil actions of his brothers. And he's angry. And he's upset. And they show up, and now he's got a little bit of power. He's in a position of power, and his brothers are begging him for food. And to be honest, he doesn't know what he's going to do in that moment. I'm sure there's part of him that thought, these are my brothers. Doesn't matter if they've done wrong to me. I need to do good to them. But there's another part that thought, maybe I can get even here. Maybe it's time for them to experience some of the evil that they experienced to me. And Joseph decides to test them. And I think it's really because of his own bitterness. So he says, you know what? If you really have a younger brother, go and get him. Because here's what happened. Joseph was the youngest, the second youngest of his brothers. His mother's name was Rachel. Rachel had one other son. So Joseph had one other full brother, a young man by the name of Benjamin. Benjamin was his only full-blooded brother, and Benjamin wasn't there. He was the absolute youngest. I think Joseph wanted to know, are my brothers treating Benjamin the same way that they're treating me? Are they being evil to him? Are they jealous of him the way that they were jealous of me? So they go back to their father and they say, the man who was in charge of the grain, he was very harsh to us. He was very angry. And he said, the only way we will get grain is if we can take Benjamin back. And Jacob says, if you take Benjamin, it will kill me. And they say, Father, we must take him. So they send him back. They send him with Benjamin. So Joseph sees his young brother and he's overwhelmed with emotion, but he hides it again. And he decides he's going to keep testing him. And he takes a silver cup and he places it in Benjamin's bag, and he sends them away. He also gives them back their money and says that it's a miracle. I think, again, he's testing them. They're going to be honest or are they not? So the cup, then, that Benjamin has in his sack, he says, you thieves, you've stolen this important cup from me. And they go and they search all their sacks, and they find it in Benjamin. I think Joseph, in that moment, he wanted to know, are the brothers going to turn on him? Are they going to say, you know what? Take Benjamin. We'll take our food, you take Benjamin, and we'll just get out of here. I think he wanted to know, are they still up to their evil ways because of the evil they had shown him? But instead, at this point, the brothers have changed their hearts, and they say, don't take Benjamin. Our father will die if he doesn't come back. Take me instead. Judah actually says, take me. I'll stay. I'll be your prisoner for life. And he shows honor. And at that moment, I think that Joseph, he allowed his heart to be softened, because God was with Joseph. I think at that moment, he decided, you know what? I'm going to overcome the bitterness, the anger, the hurt. And God, I'm going to give in to you, and I'm going to choose to have a Christ-like attitude. I'm going to choose to have a godly attitude. Joseph could stand it no longer. There were many people in the room, and he said to one of his attendants, all of you, out. So he was alone with his brothers when he told them who he was. Then he broke down and wept. He wept so loudly the Egyptians could hear him, and word of it quickly carried to Pharaoh's palace. I am Joseph, he said to his brothers. Is my father still alive? But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of him. Please come closer, he said to them. So they came closer. And he said again, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset, and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you, preserve your lives. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years, and there'll be neither plowing nor harvesting. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, and not you. And he is the one who made me advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace, and the governor of all Egypt. Joseph had to work through his grief. I think this is important. Because choosing to smile in the midst of trials and hardships, it is a choice, but it's a process too, friends. It's not something that just happens overnight. Joseph had to work through those emotions. I think he had to continually go to God. And finally he says, God, I'm going to choose joy. The joy that you have, and not bitterness and not anger. And Joseph suffered, I think, for a little while because of the internal strife that he was feeling. But in the end, he decided to give himself over to God. God is at work the entire time through the whole story. So I think God used all of the suffering that Joseph experienced to do 3 things. Okay, here we go. You can write them down. The first is that God used Joseph's suffering to teach. To teach. And God uses our suffering to teach us as well. Could you hear at the end of that just how much of a changed man Joseph is? Brothers, don't be mad at yourselves. God used this. He did this for his glory. Also, God uses Joseph's suffering to strengthen. Number 2 is to strengthen him. And God uses our suffering to strengthen us, to make us stronger people, to increase our faith, to increase our will. God uses suffering in our life to strengthen us. And then finally, and this is important, God uses suffering to further his plan. To further his plan. God's invisible plan that we can't always see. God is always at work, and he never leaves us. And he continues to build and build and build his plan. So when we were being investigated for child abuse, we were assigned a doctor who was the lead investigatory doctor. He's an expert in Northwest Ohio for child abuse. And he came in and he started to read all of those tests, all of those scans. And we knew who he was because, again, when he showed up, we didn't write consent for those scans and those tests. We didn't have a choice because this procedure had kicked into place. So we knew exactly who this doctor was, a guy by the name of Dr. Randy. And we decided, Sarah and I did, that even though we didn't feel like celebrating, we didn't feel like being joyous, we decided we were going to show God's love to each and every person that walked into our hospital room, whether we felt like it or not. It didn't matter if it was a cleaning staff, didn't matter if it was a nurse, didn't matter if it was a doctor. We were going to try to show the love of God to the best of our ability, whether we felt like it or not. So we came in and we started to talk with Dr. Randy. And he was very standoffish toward us. He didn't want to get too involved with us. But we would say hi to him in the lunchroom. We would say hi to him when he came into our room. And we continued to talk with him every time that we could. And I remember it was right before we were going to the University of Michigan to do one of Jackson's big surgeries. Dr. Randy called me and he said, I've looked at all the scans. I've looked at all the tests. I cannot find any indication of child abuse at all, and there's no case here. He said, the worst part of my job is when I feel like I've put an innocent family through the ringer, and I feel like that's what I've done here. And he started crying. He said, I hope you can forgive me for the evil that I have caused you. And I said, Dr. Randy, I don't hate you, because you're trying to protect kids, and you have a very difficult job. And I said, whether you believe it or not, I said, I've actually been praying for you. I've been praying for you that you would experience the same love and grace that Sarah and I have in my life. And the next time that we saw him, I invited him to church. I said, I'm a pastor at a church. I said, do you have a church home? And he said, Luke, you don't understand. He said, I can't go to a church. He said, people hate me. He goes, when I go to Walmart, people scream at me. I'm the guy who got their kids taken away. He said, I could never belong to a church. And I said, Dr. Randy, I don't hate you. I'd be honored if you would come to my church. I said, you can come in late and leave early. Maybe you can slip in and out. Nobody will even know you're there. And he said, thank you. But later I found he took the invite card I gave him and he threw it right in the trash on the way out. I didn't see Dr. Randy again for months. It was a long time. 18 months actually went. I did not see him. Jackson continued to be in the hospital. We were hospitalized from the beginning of June through mid-September. We lived in the hospital for 4 months. Jackson had 18 trips to the operating room. He was very sick. He was on heavy morphine. A few times we thought we were going to lose him. And I prayed over and over, God, deliver my son, heal him. And God never gave that miraculous one-time healing. Instead, God's plan was to slowly make Jackson better over the course of 2.5 years and 18 surgeries. I can tell you today that my son is a happy, healthy second grader. And if you knew him, you would have no idea. We can clap for that. If you saw him today, you would have no idea that he was ever in the hospital. And God did deliver him and heal him, but it wasn't on my timetable. It was on his timetable. 18 months went by. I did not see Dr. Randy one time. We were having a celebration at our church. It was our 15-year anniversary. And as I was walking into the parking lot, I looked over and I saw Dr. Randy, and he started crying. And he said, I'm here because of you. He said, I'm here because I want to be around people like you. He said, I remember the love you showed me and the love that Sarah showed me. He said, I've never experienced love like that before. And I hit a rough patch in my life. I wanted to be around people like you. And because of that, he said, I'm here in this parking lot today. Randy gave his life to Christ. Randy's father came to church. He gave his life to Christ. Randy's mom came to church. She gave her life to Christ. Randy's brother came to church. He gave his life to Christ. About 6 months after that meeting in the parking lot, Randy's mother tragically died, passed away. And Randy spoke at her funeral, and he stood up in front of his family and friends, and he said, friends, Mom was happy and content for the first time in her life because we were together at church, and we found out that we have a loving Father who loves us more than we will ever know. And I sat back and I thought, who is this mighty man? This man that said, people hate me, I could never go to church, that now was telling all of his family about God. And I sat back and I thought of my son. And I thought, God, I never understood why Jackson had to suffer like he did. You know, I asked that question why over and over and over. And I realized in that moment that God has a plan so much bigger than me. And that Jackson was God's son first. And that I had to entrust him to God. And the suffering that Jackson experienced and we experienced, even though it was no fault of our own, it happened so that the glory of God could be seen.